What a beautiful day for FSMA Friday. My name is Jim Albright, and this is going to be a really fun webinar because we're going to be putting on our swim caps, goggles, and nose plugs and diving in to the recently finalized FDA Agricultural Water Rule. Now, before we begin, for those who are new to the series, FSMA Friday started about just over a decade ago. And we're here to provide food and beverage manufacturers, processors, and distributors a place to get regular insights and guidance around changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. And it's brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group. Now, we want this to be your chance to not just learn about approaches to meet FSMA requirements, but to connect directly with food safety experts over at TAG to get your questions answered. Now, before we begin, because we want to ensure all of the content gets through today, we've muted all attendee mics, but we are leaving room at the end for some questions. So please, at any time during the course of the presentation, you can use the panel you see there on your right to submit your questions, and we will get through as many of them as we can. Now, if we happen to run out of time today, don't worry, we'll follow up with any unanswered questions after the session. And yes, we are recording this, so we will send you that replay along with the slides later today in your inbox. So please do keep a lookout. All right, now that the boring stuff is out of the way, I am really excited to introduce our speaker. I'm thrilled to have back with us Dr. Angela Ferelli Gruber. Angela specializes in FSMA produce safety rule compliance, helping companies update their hazard assessments, food safety plans, and of course, improve operational performance. Now, she's also a lead trainer for FSMA PSR and actively contributes to food safety initiatives through organizations like the Northeast Center for Advanced Food Safety and the International Association for Food Protection. So, Angela, welcome back to FSMA Friday.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Now, I know you have a few FSMA updates before we go into the water rule here. So why don't we dive into that? Here we are. Okay, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few updates this month, some regarding FSMA and some regarding some FDA updates. So first, regarding FSMA, we do have two updates here. FSMA 204, the FDA has put live on their page, their FSMA 204 landing page, that they have created a downloadable electronic sortable spreadsheet template. You're welcome to use that, or just view it as maybe a template so that you can mirror your own strategy against it. You're not required to use this exact template. They're providing it as a resource. There's also a new FAQ that's been published on the FAQ page that a little bit more outlines some information about previously frozen foods and how they relate to other foods on the FTL. And then they also have provided a Sprout supply chain example to help folks work through specific critical tracking events and key data elements related to that commodity. In terms of the preventive controls for human food rule, the FSPCA has been working on a version 2.0. That standard version was mentioned in their recent newsletter that it's been reviewed by FDA, and all of y'all on the call can expect lead instructor refresher training coming soon, provided in the newsletter from FSPCA. There were a couple of links to put yourself on some waiting lists. So if that is something that you are interested in doing, I would advise to go ahead and get your name on those lists. Other FDA updates include these 4 bullet points here. Number 1, FDA has shared that they have some updates regarding their progress on their work to better understand PFAs. So again, that's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So they are including some recent test results that they've been working on, continuing effort to supplement the database that they have in monitoring activities, and updated analytical measures to measure PFAs in the food supply. And then, an update that just came out yesterday. The FDA announced a study that is being conducted of supply, market competition, and regulation of infant formula in the U.S. on the 24th. They put out that they have another date for the rescheduled webinar on mushroom growing, harvesting, holding, and packing activities. So feel free to go to the CIFSAN update page and that specific update if you would like to get on that rescheduled webinar for mushroom information. And earlier this month, on the 2nd, the FDA did announce that they revoked regulation allowing the use of brominated vegetable oil in food. Go right ahead, next slide. All right, but today we're here to talk a little bit about water that folks use on produce farms. So to introduce myself just briefly again, hi all, name's Angela Ferelli Gruber. I'm a senior food safety manager at the Acheson Group, and today we're going to be talking about one of the FSMA rules, the produce safety rule, and specifically the new final rule on pre-harvest agricultural water. We're going to go through in this talk kind of what it means as to you as a grower, as well as you as a manufacturer or retailer who's receiving fresh produce product, and how you can start preparing for compliance. So the first question to sort of answer with this, to provide us some context, is what is this rule? So this new regulation, in essence, is revised required practices and record keeping requirements for produce growers who are, one, subject to the FSMA produce safety rule, and two, who use water for activities where the water contacts the edible portion of the crop. And that is called agricultural water. You're going to hear me talk a lot about that throughout this presentation. That's the scope of this rule. And agricultural water means water that we're using for these direct contact uses. So for foliar applications of, for example, blueberry canes where the blueberries are already present, for overhead irrigation of crops where the crop is present, and also it includes subsurface drip irrigation of root crops that are covered under the produce safety rule. So that's kind of the scope and the overall intent of what this new regulation is. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it in the next few slides. Go ahead, next slide. All right, so who needs to know about this new rule? So if you are a produce grower who uses agricultural water, and again, when I'm talking about produce, I'm talking about specifically those commodities that are covered, that are subject to the produce safety regulation, you will have to know about this rule and be compliant to this rule. And also, it's going to be very helpful for manufacturers and retailers who have fresh produce suppliers to know what the regulation is and how to assess that your suppliers are compliant to this. Go ahead, next slide. All right, so we know that the final rule for produce safety was published a few years ago, and now we're seeing this new rule specifically for agricultural water coming along. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context of what is not changing from the original rule in terms of agricultural water and what is changing. So the big two things that are changing with this implementation of this new piece of the produce safety rule is it basically, number one, is removing the compulsory requirement for generic E. coli water quality parameters for pre-harvest agricultural water. So it's removing the requirement for generic E. coli testing. You are welcome to still test for generic E. coli. And also it's likely that third-party auditors are probably still going to expect to see testing for generic E. coli in your agricultural water for at least the foreseeable future. So that's the first big change. The second big change is that there is an addition now of a written agricultural water assessment. You can kind of think of that as a risk assessment exercise that you're going to do for your agricultural water, all types of agricultural water systems that you're using. And this needs to be completed at least annually, and it will be reviewed and signed by a supervisor. So those are the two big things that are changing from the past version of the water, agricultural water parts of the produce safety rule. But what isn't changing? So a few things are staying the same. The definition of agricultural water, as I said in the beginning, water that contacts the edible portion of the crop, that definition is not changing. The requirements of a water system inspection for pre-harvest and post-harvest water, that requirement's not changing. So now you're going to do two things. You're going to do this inspection, which has a different sort of purpose and has a different record compared to the ag water assessment that we're going to talk more about today. So that inspection is still required. The final rule has been out on post-harvest and harvest water microbial criteria and other requirements. So for example, not being able to use untreated surface water for harvest and post-harvest uses. The final rule's been out on that. We'll talk a little bit about when enforcement discretion ends for those rules, but those criteria have been set, and that's been out. And then finally, what else is not changing is that sprout water requirements are not changing. So if you're working with sprouts, the rules that you have been working with for the past few years are staying the same. All right, go ahead, next slide. Okay, so you as a farmer have to complete at least an annual ag water assessment unless you can claim an exemption. And there are 3 cases here that I've outlined that are outlined as exemptions in the regulation. So number 1, if your water meets requirements for harvest and post-harvest agricultural water, you can be exempt from needing an ag water assessment. So that means that the microbial criteria is you're following that, you're testing that water, and it's hitting those parameters for harvest and post-harvest water, and you are not using untreated surface water. The second scenario is if you are using public water and have certificates of compliance, you will not need to do an ag water assessment. Or your water is treated per PSR regulation, and this, we do know that water treatment is still a hot topic, and there seems to be resources that are going to be forthcoming for this. So just hang tight in terms of water treatment, and keep up talking with your extension agents and with TAG if you're struggling with water treatment at this time. But please do know that in the future, more resources and support is coming for this. Okay, so these are the 3 scenarios where you won't have to do a water assessment, an ag water assessment. However, there's a caveat at the bottom of this slide that's important. You can only claim these if you have, you're reasonably certain that the quality of the water is not going to change from the source of the water to when you're using it. So for example, if you're using public water, but then you're pumping it into like an open vat and then further pumping it for the use, you won't be able to claim this exemption because it's reasonably likely that the quality of that water is going to change from the public water source to how you're using it. So the FDA did put this in here. So this is an extra parameter that you'll have to evaluate if you're looking to claim one of these exemptions from needing to complete an ag water assessment. All right, next slide. Okay, so the overall goal of the ag water assessment is to take a risk assessment approach to ensure that we have water of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, i.e. direct use onto fruits and vegetables covered under the produce safety rule. So we're going to talk through some general tenets of how this risk assessment, how this ag water assessment is structured. So you are going to evaluate factors related to your water source and use. You're going to gather findings, and then based on those findings, you are going to take actions, some of which are mandated per the regulation that we'll go through based on these outcomes. So this is the general structure of how an ag water assessment is going to look like. Go ahead, next slide. So the FDA has outlined factors to consider in your ag water assessment for each of your ag water systems. You must complete an assessment for each ag water system. So if you have significantly different sources or significantly different methods of irrigation, you might need separate assessments. So for example, if you have a well for some ag water uses, and you have a canal or pond for other ag water uses, it's very likely you'll have to do two different assessments, because they have, each of those scenarios have different risk profiles associated with them. But you are able to group like systems if you can make a justification that they're like enough to be grouped. So you could potentially get away with one ag water assessment, but it just kind of depends on, what you're irrigating, how you're irrigating, who your neighbors are, different things like that. So I'm going to go through some of the factors. Well, these are the general buckets of factors listed here. There's a little bit more in-depth discussion on each of these factors that FDA has provided in a fact sheet that is in the link at the bottom of this slide. The first bucket is the nature of each ag water system. So is it ground or surface water? Is the conveyance open or closed? What's the degree of physical protection along the source and the conveyance? What is the degree of protection from other water uses, from animal activity along the conveyance or the source? If you're subject to nearby adjacent land uses related to animal activity. So this is a big one, right? So if you find, and we'll talk about this more in the outcomes, but being near animal operations is going to put you in a different sort of category, potentially, where you might have to manage that a little bit more actively than being near something that's like other mixed fruit and vegetable farms or residential areas. And then the last one related to this bucket is application of animal fertilizers. So BSAAOs are biological soil amendments of animal origin, specifically if they're untreated. So this is like raw chicken manure or uncomposted cow manure, things like that, and the presence of untreated human waste. The next bucket of factors to consider is agricultural water practices associated with each system. So this includes the type of irrigation method. So if it's just direct foliar or drip to subsurface produce, the root crops. The next one is the time interval between the last direct application of water and harvesting that produce. So both of those can also kind of influence your risk profile. The next one's crop characteristics. So this includes the physical characteristics of the crop. If the crop has had any significant damage due to weather events, and also susceptibility of the crop to surface adhesion or internalization. This last piece here is, we're all in the know, the extension professionals and the FDA and us as consultants know that there is not enough research in this area. And there will likely be more research in this area as we move forward in the coming years. So we are going to take the approach of what we know now about the risk of the crop, which includes historic risk of certain crops, and whatever research is available to make the best sort of determination in terms of risk for this one. But, do know that everybody understands that this is kind of still a burgeoning area of research where more research is needed. The next bucket is environmental conditions. So that includes kind of where you are in the world and what your climate looks like, what your weather looks like. So if you're farming somewhere where there's a high possibility of continuous dry and windy conditions, that can be something to take note, because we do know that dry and windy conditions can potentially be problematic, a little bit higher risk, depending again on other factors like who your neighbors are, what they're doing, things like that. Frequency of heavy rain or other extreme weather events. So we do know that flooding and hurricanes can also significantly increase risk to the crop, both like risk of the crop of, might not be having anything to harvest because of the damage, and then also potential contamination. And then the season, because we do know that for many of these, at least bacterial and the parasitic foodborne pathogens, there is a seasonality aspect to it where we do see in the summer months and even early fall, we see a little bit higher incidence of contamination. So just another thing to consider. And then other factors, and this may include testing for a scientifically valid indicator. This is where you can include your generic E. coli testing following the previous PSR outlined guidelines of testing or other scientifically valid scheme. So those are the factors to consider. So that's going to be all the data you're going to collect in your ag water assessment for each of your systems. Go ahead, next slide. So how would we put this into practice? I decided to come up with just a really basic simplified example just to get us thinking of, how we would assess some of these buckets. We have in the scenario here attached to the picture, we've got surface water used for an overhead irrigating melon situation from transplant to harvest during the summer season in the mid-Atlantic. This farm doesn't test water currently. They use synthetic fertilizer and their neighbors are residential. So we've got that information about this water source. We also have the visual information from the picture where we're seeing it's a pond. We're also seeing some animal activity in this water. And this is a farm picture that I took during, working in my many years of being on farms. And, it's not super uncommon. So how would we assess this, right? So I have just, again, to think about it in a simplified way, this would not be, you would need to do likely more for the ag water assessment to be compliant, right? But just to get us thinking about how we would assess this in terms of buckets of risk, right? So the red square is a little bit maybe higher risk, and the green square is maybe a little bit lower risk. So in terms of ground or surface water, it's surface water, which we know is a little bit higher risk than groundwater. The conveyance might be closed, so that's maybe a little bit lower risk. Degree of protection from a myriad of different influences. So we do see that we've got some animal activity in the water. Maybe this is common animal activity in this water. So maybe we, based on our historic knowledge of the common activity in this water, we might assess this as a little bit higher risk. We know that synthetic fertilizers used, so we might do that fourth bucket down a little bit lower risk, right? We also know that the melons are overhead irrigated right up to harvest, so those are maybe a little bit higher risk. We are in the mid-Atlantic, so we're in the mid-Atlantic and we're using melons, so we're going to kind of put that in the middle of the road for now, right? In your own assessment, you might be swayed to assess that higher or lower depending on your specific information and the experts that you work with to determine the specific risk regarding those two buckets. We know the Mid-Atlantic isn't super well known for being dry or windy, so we're going to make that maybe a little bit lower risk. And we're in the summer season, so we'll kind of put that in the middle of the road. All right, so we've got those buckets there. So with that information, we would then move on to the next piece of that, which is gathering the data and determining what the outcomes are based on these findings. Go ahead, next slide. So based on your findings from these ag water assessments, the rule requires that farms implement effective corrective mitigation measures, effective corrective or mitigation measures within specific timeframes. So the key operating terms here that I'm saying are effective. So the FDA does require you to sort of evaluate whatever you're doing to manage any sort of risk that you're determining needs to take action. They're saying that you need to make sure that it has been effective. And then also what's kind of a deviation from previous iterations of ag water quality management is that there are some specific timeframes that some of these activities must be done depending on the outcomes. So this is a great fact sheet that the FDA has provided that kind of bin the different outcomes that you can find yourself in and what you need to do based on that. And that is available at the link provided in the slide. Go ahead, next slide. So just to go through a few of these. So based on your findings, right, you're going to either determine, one, in the red, your water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality. If you find that out, you will have to immediately discontinue use and implement corrective measures before resuming use of that water for agricultural water. Go ahead, click once. Great. And so the FDA has outlined what they mean and what can be available to you as corrective measures. That's available in the link at the bottom of the slide here. But just to pull out a few of the highlights from that fact sheet, corrective measures include treating the water per the regulations in the PSR, re-inspecting the ag water system that is under your control and fixing any problems found. And with both of these, as I mentioned in the last slide, you must determine that your measures are effective. So that can be, water testing pre and post treatment. That's using a scientifically valid sampling method, things like that. And we, TAG and other extension experts, can help you determine your strategy in these cases. So if you find that some of your risks in your ag water assessment, some of your factors that you've evaluated are leaning towards high risk and they're in the area of adjacent or nearby land uses that are reasonably likely to introduce known or foreseeable hazards, or from animal activity, those animal fertilizers, BSAAOs, or human treated waste. So if you're seeing any of those factors having some elevated risk, you will be in the orange category likely, and the regulation outlines that you are to implement mitigation measures promptly and no later than the end of the same growing season for that ag water system and those crops. So in our last simplified example, right, we did pick out that there were the dog activity, the animal activity in that water source could potentially put us in this yellow category, right? We would want to make sure that we've got the findings from our other categories are also kind of in agreement that we're leaning towards this orange state. So I'll outline for you a few of the a few pieces of data that the FDA states that you can include as mitigation measures. So go ahead and give one more click. So again, outlining mitigation measures is also in this FDA fact sheet that's at a link at the bottom of the slide here. So mitigation measures can include what I outlined above. So treating the water per the PSR, re-inspecting the system, fixing any problems found. You can also potentially, right, based on your scenario and what's appropriate for you. And again, TAG can help you figure out what is appropriate for you. Increase the time between the last direct application and harvest of that crop, or storage of that crop to allow for die-off. And this needs to be hand in hand with supporting scientific data to support that strategy. Or you can change the water application method. So for example, potentially moving from overhead of some crops to drip. So in the melon example, we could move our overhead to a drip situation and reduce our risk. All right, so if you're not finding any significant high risk factors in the orange category, but you are finding that are some other conditions that might be reasonably likely to introduce some foreseeable hazards, then the FDA outlines in this case, you're also required to implement some mitigation measure as soon as you can and no later than the following year. And in this case, this is where you can use water testing to be able to better inform what sort of action that you can take. An important piece about water testing is that you can employ it, except for in the case of if you're in a situation where waiting for water tests is going to delay public health decisions. You can't really use water testing in that regard, right? So so those are the three big buckets. The fourth bucket, if you go, no all the way down from your ag water assessment and you find yourself in the green, you haven't seen any significant big risks, then the FDA recommends that you continue regular inspection, preventative maintenance, and water quality management of your ag water system. So, just continue the good agricultural practices, and following the other PSR regulations per ag water use on your farm, and keep going. Have your supervisor sign and date this ag water assessment and keep it as a living document. Next slide. So you want to keep this as a living document because you are going to conduct reassessments at least annually of all of your ag water systems. You will also have other trigger points where you will be required to do a reassessment, and TAG can help you in this case kind of outline what those triggers should be for your specific operation. So this can include when you have a significant change in your water source or how you're using that water. If there is a significant event that changes your risk profile of your agricultural water. So if there's a significant weather event, if you've had significant one-off flooding, you will likely want to reassess that ag water assessment to see if you're still in the same risk category or if you need to do other actions to keep your water at an adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. Go ahead, next slide. All right, so kind of talked a little bit about what this new regulation is, kind of walked you through what it looks like, but how are you going to prepare for it? So if you're a produce grower, and again, this is produce that's covered by the produce safety rule, and you use ag water, we would recommend that if you haven't already started, assemble a cross-functional team. So quality assurance, food safety people, operations, some other folks, whoever else needs to be in the room, get your team together and use that team to determine how many ag water assessments you're going to have to do every year. Establish a budget and a timeline for how those ag water assessments are going to need to be completed, as well as a budget and timeline for potential actions that you may need to take based on outcomes. Write up some workflows, I would recommend, of how you're going to manage these interpretation of the findings, and train everybody on, both communication of interpretation of findings and how they're going to execute actions based on outcomes. And also, I would recommend training workers, your boots on the ground folks, on ag water risk assessment and communication of big risks that they might see, because they're definitely your front line, and they can communicate and be your ally in communicating, when a significant change has occurred in the quality of your ag water, to be able to inform quickly, maybe you need to do a reassessment or maybe you need to take action. So I always encourage letting folks on the front line know about, how to spot something that's risky and communicate it up the line quickly. And continue to manage your ag water quality using your good agricultural practices that we all know and love. Go ahead, give a click. Okay, if you are a manufacturer or retailer who has fresh produce suppliers, I would recommend that you get your team together and review and update the approved supplier evaluation procedures to include this new requirement in the produce safety rule. I would also notify your fresh produce suppliers of the change and provide resources that I'll give on the next slide if needed. And also, TAG does provide technical assistance to these folks if they need to figure out where they need to start with this, or how to do an ag water assessment. And then I would schedule based on the compliance dates, which I'll show in a few slides. Look out to the calendar to figure out when you need to schedule reevaluation of your fresh produce suppliers. All right, go ahead, next slide. Okay, so a few resources. So we have first here a link to the FSMA final rule on pre-harvest agricultural water. All the fact sheets that I talked about in this talk are accessible from this landing page. Also accessible from this landing page, but what I wanted to pull out is the FDA's Ag Water Assessment Builder. This is a great foundational tool to walk you through the factors and kind of gets you in the muscle memory of using risk assessment to gather data about these factors and potentially determine some outcomes. I do have a note at the bottom of this slide that is present in both number 2 and number 3 resources, that use of any tool doesn't specifically on its own guarantee compliance, right? You have to use this and then also do your own due diligence to make sure that the factors you're evaluating and the outcomes are applicable and appropriate for your farm. I would also recommend this great resource that just came out of a NEFA-funded grant from University of Minnesota, Michigan State University. It's available on the Northeast Center for Advancement of Food Safety Clearinghouse and at this link. It's a risk prioritization tool for agricultural water. This is especially helpful for farms or for anyone who wants to kind of learn about risk assessment in agricultural water, and it walks you through how to prioritize and evaluate different risk factors related to ag water. And then finally, I linked the Acheson Group. We can certainly help you setting up or walking through your ag water assessments, provide technical support in evaluation of some of the factors if needed, support the strategy and support developing different protocols for actions based on outcome, and also support developing trainings and executing trainings if needed for workers. Go ahead, next slide. So the last piece of this is the compliance dates. In the first bucket here, the pre-harvest ag water system inspection maintenance and the system assessment, so the risk assessment that we just talked about throughout this entire talk, those compliance dates start 9 months after the effective date. The effective date, I think, was earlier this month. So for businesses that are over 500,000 production in produce sales average per year over the last 3 years, your compliance date is April 7th of 2025. For small businesses, your compliance date is April 6th of 2026. And for very small businesses, your compliance date is April 5th of 2027. The harvest and post-harvest water requirements, remember I talked about them in the beginning of this talk, those are parts that are not changing. They're kind of irrespective of this ag water system, ag water assessment, sorry. There was some enforcement discretion with those while FDA kind of figured out what their strategy was going to be with ag water assessments. There will be an end of enforcement discretion, though, for compliance to the harvest and post-harvest water requirements. So that's already ended for large businesses, and for small businesses, for very small businesses, it's expected that you are fully compliant by next year, January 26th, 2025. And with that, I think that's my last slide. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow. Okay. We got some questions for you, Angela, but first, that was amazing. This is obviously some new stuff for folks. Maybe not if you've been paying attention and reading some of the headlines that have been popping out here, but overall, I took a ton of notes, so I learned a lot from this presentation personally. I wanted to start off just kind of understanding a little bit more about evaluation of risk, because you started off saying, well, you'd have to do these assessments at least once a year, but it's, at least I'm reading into this, that the tone is you really should be doing this a lot more frequently than that, and obviously having it reviewed, signed off on. Um, Is there so when it comes to like mitigation methods, I think there was a bullet that you had shared that said the FDA requires you to evaluate potential risks and show or prove that your mitigation methods are effective. So, in my mind, the only way to do that is to regularly do these assessments. Maybe it's every 3 months, for example. What is your take on that?
It could be a few things. I think the FDA goes into a little bit more detail in that fact sheet about reviewing effectiveness. It can be reassessment, it can be water testing, right? It can be through visual observation. There are a few avenues that one can take. The FDA does endeavor to be a little bit flexible,
Mm,
but they did put that in there kind of as a follow up where you can't you don't we don't want people to just do an activity and then be like, okay, we're good, right? A
yep.
follow up to sort of verify that what you're doing is effective.
Okay. All right. So another point that you had showed on the screen talked about adjacent or nearby land use where there might be some animal activities going on. It also said that you must implement a mitigation measure no later than the same growing season. Um, so that to me sounds like the current season. Is that correct or no?
Yes, that is correct. So before the end of that growing season with that specific ag water system.
All right, excellent. Okay, I got some questions here. When you were talking about the differences in water usage, I got a few questions that came in there. So I'm just going to scroll up here so we can see those. All right, we have Felipe who was saying that they're using potable water. Is that considered under this rule okay? So long as it's been kind of stamped as certified and good to go?
So if you're using potable water from a public hookup, you can potentially claim an exemption from needing an ag water assessment if you have the data to show that water isn't changing significantly in quality from the source to when you're using it. So I provided the example. Some folks have a potable water source. They pump it into an open tank and then pump it that further down to the use. That would kind of throw you out of contention for having an exemption because that water quality is going to change because you're pumping it into an open vat. If you have
Mhm.
potable water from a well, then I would recommend trying to pursue an exemption that was under that first category of if that well is hitting the criteria for harvest and post-harvest water uses per the produce safety rule, which potable wells will hit if you are doing your testing.
Hmm.
But again, the same things applies, right? If you're pumping out of a well and then the quality, that the quality is likely to change between pumping out of a well and getting to the point of use, you won't be able to claim an exemption from doing the ag water assessment. Is that helpful?
Right, right. I think so. Yeah, and Jesse was asking a similar question around city water use, and so long as there's no difference in the city water that's been again treated or certified as being okay, it's okay.
Yep, you want to have your certificates of compliance on file with you. So usually for city water, the city websites will have that. The municipality should have that available. The last few years of water testing, they should have that available. And if they don't, you can call them up and ask them to provide it to you, and you would put that on file at your farm.
Okay. When it comes to the assessment, Sophia wants to know is there any specifics needed around microbial criteria or testing of microbes?
When it comes to the assessment. So you're welcome to use microbial testing. And the FDA does say that if you're doing microbial testing, the same as how they outlined it in the previous iteration of the rule, you're welcome to use that to feed into the assessment as a potential factor. As I mentioned, you can't use testing if it's going to delay public health decisions, but you can use it as one of your factors to, understand more information about the water system. It has to be a scientifically valid indicator, and we know that one of the ones right now is generic E. coli. So,
Hmm. All right, I love this one here from Sue. She's saying they have customers that want test verification from suppliers, but she's also saying that many suppliers are pushing back when they're asking for their test results because they're saying that it falls under their audit and it wouldn't have passed their audit without doing so. So, how would they require the suppliers to provide these types of assessments on request? What types of insights or tips would you recommend here?
oh, so that's a really good question. I think there's a couple parts to it too. So I'm happy to chat more offline with her. If it's a question about trying to get your suppliers to provide their ag water assessments, I mean, I think that's a best practice. I think that there should, like, if I was trying to vet suppliers, it would be great. A good supplier relationship would be if they would feel comfortable either hopping on the phone with me to go through their ag water assessment or by sending me their ag water assessment. Um, I understand some other part of the question was about testing, and I think, are we talking about testing for water testing?
I assume that's the case, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so as the buyer, right, you can still mandate kind of that you want their water to be tested. It's no longer a requirement in the rule. However, as I mentioned, it's probably likely going to still be on third party audits, at least for the near future. So, again, I would say it's best practice in a good supplier buyer relationship if suppliers feel comfortable to share water test results. It just gives you another level of assurance. um,
Yeah,
Specifically, I would say honestly a little bit more for our wells. And if we're just getting a one snapshot in time of a pond or canal, right? You do need, I would say you do need more tests to
yeah,
figure out what that risk profile really looks like. But all to say, I'd say it's best practice if those things are shared right now, since this rule is removing the requirement for compulsory generic E. coli testing. Um, we don't have sort of the regulation to say like you must share this with me, but I would say it's a good practice, and it's probably likely going to continue to be required on third party audits, if that's helpful. But happy to chat more about it.
that's great. Yeah, Sue's wanting to connect with you offline, so we'll definitely pass that information over, and that sounds good to me. All right, here's one from Evelyn. We have a preseason risk assessment for our growers to complete. There is a section to evaluate their water system. Will this be sufficient enough for them to be in compliance with the new rule? And would you recommend having a separate assessment altogether?
I think it's number one great that you have them go through this assessment. I think that I would spend some time comparing what you currently have to what the regulation is requiring, and there may be some points that you might have to tweak, um, so that you can get to a point where they have to just do this, right? With the caveat at the bottom that says, like, if something changes, you're going to have to reassess this water, the ag water part again, per the regulation, right? If there's a significant change in water use or an event or something like that. But you absolutely can kind of see or figure out how to make what you're already using compliant with the rule. It's probably going to be an exercise of going through the regulation and the fact sheets that I shared to make sure that the factors that you're asking about are also covered in the regulation, and the outcomes that you're mandating that they do are also
Got it.
outlined with regulation.
Okay. Angela, you cut off a little bit there, so I hope you're still with us.
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Um, so we do have a lot of food manufacturers who join FSMA Friday, and when I know you had one section of your presentation that did specifically talk to them, and a lot of that did have to do with suppliers and kind of what we were just talking about. Is there anything like in particular, such as like you have to update your food safety plan or some other like risk management plan uh, to get this as part of that plan?
So if you already have in your supplier, like approved supplier programs that you are accepting produce from entities that are compliant with the produce safety rule, this is a part of the produce safety rule. So you will not have to change anything about that. If you have
Got it.
specific items in how you're evaluating your supplier, you might want to look at those programs to make sure that that language is aligned with the new requirements of this part of the ag water rule.
Okay, perfect. All right, I hope that makes sense. I do not see any other questions coming in, but you guys can certainly still submit questions. And like I said earlier, we will get back to you with some answers once we see them. So, not to worry. But Angela, this was amazing. And I'm really looking forward to having you back to get an update on how this rule is working for everybody. Oh, hold on. I think we just got another question. If you want to hang out, we have one from Dale. He says, occasionally, we receive products such as carrots and onions from Mexico growers. Will we be required to have the Mexico growers supply water assessments and test results as well?
So that's a great question, and it's going to depend if you are if you have a situation where you are applying a validated kill step to that product, the pepper or what was it, carrots and onions. If you're
Hmm.
applying a validated kill step to those products, right? There is an agreement that you can have with those growers that is part of the exemption piece of the produce safety rule writ large. That means that if that is happening, then that grower won't have to, in some cases, like uh, comply to most of the produce safety rule writ large. Okay, so if you're someone who's cooking a vegetable, or if you're sending it through HPP, a validated kill step, you're in a kind of another category. But if you're getting these carrots and onions and you're using them fresh or fresh cut, um, then it would apply. And you would want to expect that those growers that you're using are completing these assessments by the compliance dates, are completing these assessments. Now, as I mentioned, the testing, compulsory testing is no longer required. It can be a buyer expectation that you require it for them, right? But it's no longer required per the regulation.
That makes sense. Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to the next slide and just say, if you all have other questions as you're sleeping on this overnight and you wake up in the middle of the night, say, oh, I forgot to ask this. You can reach out to the folks at TAG. Obviously, Angela would be happy to work with you, or anybody over at TAG who understands this would be able to work with you. Um, in terms of general food safety, compliance, FSMA, we have a lot of resources that we've been working in collaboration with TAG. You can head on over to safetychain.com to check those out. And of course, we want to see everybody on our next FSMA Friday, always on the last Friday of the month. And we do appreciate, Angela, having you on this time. And we want to make sure that, again, we follow up with you later as we get closer to those compliance dates. And we thank everybody for joining us today. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend ahead.
Thanks so much for having me.
Take care, everybody.